Have you ever opened up a credit card bill,
Yeah.
looked at a balance of, say, $5,000, and then felt this bizarre, almost irrational wave of relief when you see the minimum payment due is only like $35?
Oh, yeah. That wave of relief is incredibly common.
Right. I mean, you click pay, you breathe a sigh of relief, and you just go about your day feeling like you've somehow handled your finances.
Exactly. But if you are nodding your head right now, listening to this, you aren't bad at math. You are actually the victim of decades of highly engineered behavioral psychology.
Which is wild to think about. Today, we are dismantling the hidden architecture of consumer debt.
Yeah, it really is a profound realization that the tools we use to manage our money, well, they're not neutral, not at all.
No, they definitely not.
The interface on your smartphone, the layout of a paper statement, the exact phrasing of a checkout button, none of these are accidental. They are the culmination of massive amounts of data and psychological testing.
Basically designed to bypass your rational decision-making, right?
Precisely. We are examining an ecosystem where interface designers and financial architects map out these incredibly specific cognitive traps.
Which means we are essentially exploring a two-front war for your attention and, well, your wallet.
That's a great way to put it, a two-front war.
Yeah, because we have the legal frameworks and behavioral economics on one side, concepts that have been analyzed deeply by places like the Wharton School and the Texas Law Review. And then on the flip side, we have the digital battlefield, which is mapped out in user experience reports from the FTC and financial design agencies like UFDA.
Right, and so our mission today for this deep dive is to pull back the curtain on all this machinery.
Exactly, because the moment you understand the mechanics of how these traps are set, I mean, they lose their power over you.
They really do. But to understand the modern digital traps, we first have to understand the business model they serve. We need to look at how credit transitioned from this localized merchant convenience into a massive, algorithmically driven profitability engine.
An engine based entirely on revolving debt.
Right. So if we rewind to the early 20th century, credit was fundamentally different. By 1928, the standard was something called the Farrington Charga Plate.
Okay, wait, I love this part. This was basically a literal dog tag for shopping.
Much? Yeah.
It was a small piece of sheet metal embossed with your name and address, slipped into a little leather case. You would go to a specific department store. The clerk would take this metal plate, put it into a heavy manual imprinter, lay a carbon paper slip over it, and just physically crush it down to record the charge.
That physical friction is key here. I mean, the Charga Plate sped up bookkeeping, but it was strictly merchant credit.
Right. You owed that specific store.
Exactly. And the store held the risk. The goal for the store wasn't to make money off interest. That wasn't a thing. The goal was simply to foster customer loyalty and increase sales volume.
So it was just a perk of shopping there.
Right. Fast forward to 1950, and you see the introduction of the Diners Club card by Ralph Schneider and Frank McNamara. This was a monumental leap because it introduced the general purpose card.
Meaning you could use it at more than one place.
Yeah. You could use one piece of cardboard, and it literally was cardboard back then. Multiple participating restaurants.
But the crucial distinction there is that Niners Club was a charge card, not a credit card.
Yes. Very important distinction.
At the end of the month, you received a bill, and you were required to pay the entire balance in full. There was no carrying a balance. There was no rolling it over. If you spent $100, you owed $100 immediately.
Which brings us to the hinge point of modern consumer finance, which is 1958.
The Fresno drop.
Yes. Bank of America launched the Bank AmeriCard in Fresno, California, in an event famously known as the Fresno drop.
It sounds like a military operation.
It kind of was, to solve the classic chicken and egg problem of getting merchants to accept a card that nobody had and getting people to carry a card that no merchant accepted. Bank of America just bypassed the friction entirely.
They just forced it.
They mailed out 60,000 live, unsolicited credit cards to the residents of Fresno. Yeah, they targeted a city where 45% of the population already banked with them.
And the chaos that followed is legendary. I mean, people were handing cards to their kids, frauds skyrocketed, default rates initially spiked. It was a massive, messy social experiment.
Complete chaos. But out of that chaos, Bank of America proved something revolutionary.
What was that?
That a third-party bank could successfully issue a widely accepted card that allowed consumers to carry a balance from month to month, subject to interest. They basically proved the viability of revolving credit.
Right, and that shift from a zero balance expectation to a revolving balance fundamentally altered the incentive structure of banking.
It changed everything. It paved the way for what legal scholar Ronald Mann calls the Sweatbox business model.
The Sweatbox, that just sounds ominous.
It is. The conventional wisdom usually dictates that a bank wants you to borrow money and then reliably pay it back. But in the revolving credit paradigm, a customer who pays their balance in full every single month generates zero interest revenue.
Zero. Which is wild because the industry literally refers to these individuals as deadbeats.
Yeah, if you pay your bill on time, you're a deadbeat to them.
So the ideal customer isn't the deadbeat. The ideal customer is the one trapped in the Sweatbox.
Exactly. They have a massive balance, they are paying exorbitant interest rates, and they are highly financially distressed. But, and this is the key, they just barely manage to scrape together the minimum payment every month to avoid defaulting.
Because if they default, the bank loses the principal. So the bank wants you sweating it out month after month, year after year, because that marginal distress is the core profit engine.
That marginal distress is incredibly lucrative, but, achieving it requires careful psychological calibration.
Right, because if a consumer is entirely rational, they look at a 24% interest rate and immediately prioritize liquidating that debt.
Exactly. To keep someone in the Sweatbox, the lender has to exploit specific behavioral biases. And the most prominent of these is hyperbolic discounting.
Let's contextualize hyperbolic discounting for a second, because we all do this constantly. It is the classic future self fallacy.
Right.
Present me decides to order a massive pizza at midnight, fully convinced that future me is going to wake up at 5 a.m. and run 6 miles to burn it off. We heavily discount the future consequences of our actions in favor of immediate gratification.
Yes, perfect analogy. The academic research in the Texas Law Review illustrates how credit card design weaponizes this exact cognitive blind spot.
How so?
Well, when you apply for a credit card, you are making a decision for your future self.
Yeah.
You might think, oh, I'm only going to use this for absolute emergencies, like a blown transmission. Or I will use it for the rewards points, but pay it off every Friday.
Right, you have all the best intentions.
And in that moment, you are acting rationally because the costs, the interest, the late fees, they're theoretical and located in the distant future.
But then you are standing in an electronics store looking at an incredible 80-inch television. The benefit is immediate. You can put it in your cart today. The cost is still theoretical and in the future. So our preferences dynamically shift.
They absolutely do. And the financial institutions understand this temporal shifting perfectly. They design the onboarding experience, zero annual fees, instant digital approval, massive sign-up bonuses to overwhelm your immediate attention.
Knowing full well that your inability to accurately predict your future borrowing behavior will likely lead you straight into the Sweatbox.
Exactly.
It's like walking into a buffet. A rational actor might say, I have free will, I can just eat a sensible salad and leave. But what if the buffet is engineered to bypass that rational choice?
Like how the plates are massive, so a normal portion looks pitifully small.
Yes. The lighting, the ambient smells, the layout of the carving stations. Every sensory input is optimized to make you consume far beyond your initial plan. If you overeat, is it a failure of willpower or is it the triumph of environmental design?
Environmental design is the perfect bridge here because the environment where you actually manage your debt, the statement itself, is heavily engineered.
Right, because if the goal is to keep you in the Sweatbox, the bank's primary tool isn't to hide the bill from you.
No. Hiding the bill leads to default, and default means the bank loses its principal. Instead, their tool is to offer you a highly visible, frictionless way to feel like you are handling the bill.
Which relies on the cognitive bias known as the anchoring effect.
Yes, we see anchoring in retail all the time. If a store shows you a jacket with a massive original price, $1,000 tag crossed out, and a sale price of $400, your brain anchors to that initial $1,000.
Suddenly $400 feels like a steal, even if the jacket is really only worth $50.
Exactly. But when applied to consumer debt, the anchoring effect is completely inverted. It is weaponized downward.
Weaponized downward. I like that phrasing. How does that work on the statement?
When you look at your credit card statement, the visual hierarchy of the page is designed to guide your eye to a very specific number. Usually, it is prominently boxed, bolded, or highlighted in a contrasting color.
The minimum payment due.
That's the one. Let's say your balance is $5,000 and the minimum payment is $125. By featuring that $125 so prominently, the statement establishes a powerful cognitive anchor.
It fundamentally hijacks your financial literacy. Instead of your brain asking the necessary, painful question, how much of this $5,000 balance can I afford to liquidate this month to stop bleeding money on interest? Your brain is presented with a much simpler, highly solvable problem.
Can I afford this small $125 payment?
Exactly. The $125 frames the entire financial interaction.
And to understand how insidious this is, we really have to look at the actual mathematics of that minimum payment.
Let's do it. What's the formula?
The formula used to compute it is generally structured as the maximum of either a flat floor amount, usually $25 or $35, or a calculated formula.
Okay, and what goes into that calculation?
That formula takes the principal balance and multiplies it by a nominal percentage, typically just 1%. It then adds the accrued interest for the month, plus any penalty fees.
Wait, just 1% of the principal? Let's translate that formula into a real-world scenario because the math is staggering.
Go for it.
Okay, if you have that $5,000 balance at a 24% annual percentage rate, your interest charge for a single month is roughly $100.
Right.
And 1% of your $5,000 principal is $50. So the formula adds your $100 in interest to your $50 in principal reduction, generating a minimum payment of $150.
And when you make that $150 payment, your new balance isn't significantly dented. You paid $150 to reduce your total debt by a mere $50.
That's depressing.
It is. You are covering 100% of the bank's profit margin for the month, while making almost zero progress on the actual money you borrowed.
The math is explicitly designed to negatively amortize your life. And
But part of this mechanism is that making that payment actually feels incredibly rewarding.
because of the dopamine hit.
Yes, you log in, you click Pay Minimum, you avoid the $39 late fee, and your account status remains current. Neurologically, your brain registers this as a completed task.
You have fulfilled a social and financial obligation. Your brain releases a hit of dopamine, creating a profound false sense of financial achievement.
You feel responsible while mathematically cementing your position in the Sweatbox.
And there's empirical evidence backing this up, right? The Wharton study.
Yes, a cornerstone behavioral finance study conducted by Benjamin Keyes and Jilan Wang at the Wharton School. They analyzed data from millions of credit card accounts.
Millions. So this isn't just a small sample size.
Not at all. They wanted to see what would happen if issuers made routine, minor adjustments to their minimum payment formulas.
Because if consumers were truly paying the minimum because they were completely tapped out of liquid cash, any increase in the minimum requirement should trigger a wave of defaults or late payments, right?
Exactly. But that is not what the data showed. When the banks randomly adjusted the formula so the minimum payment increased by an average of just $15, the consumers didn't default.
They just paid it.
Yeah, 10 to 20% of the cardholders simply adjusted their payments upward to meet the new, higher minimum without a second thought. They paid the extra $15 flawlessly.
Which proves a massive behavioral blind spot. Those consumers had the liquidity. They had the disposable income to pay down their debt faster all along.
Right, but their repayment choices were not driven by hard financial constraints. They were entirely driven by cognitive anchoring to the bank's suggested number.
And conversely, when the minimum was lowered, those same consumers tracked their payments downward, perfectly syncing with the new anchor.
Exactly. It completely dictated their behavior.
It is the exact financial equivalent of a suggested serving size on a junk food label.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. You buy a giant family-sized bag of chips, and the back of the bag says, serving size, 11 chips.
And nobody eats exactly 11 chips.
Nobody. But that tiny serving size exists to make you feel psychologically okay about consuming something terrible for your health.
Yeah.
You look at the massive calorie count, divide it by the serving size, and tell yourself, well, I only had 2 or 3 servings. That's not so bad.
Right. The minimum payment is the suggested serving size of debt. It normalizes a deeply harmful financial behavior.
So, recognizing the devastating efficacy of these cognitive traps, regulators eventually attempted to intervene. This brings us to the regulatory rescue effort.
Specifically, the Credit Card Accountability, Responsibility, and Disclosure Act, universally known as the CARD Act of 2009.
Passed with strong bipartisan support, it represented a massive amendment to the Truth in Lending Act and the Federal Reserve's Regulation Z.
And the CARD Act implemented some fundamental common sense protections that seem obvious now, but were standard practice before 2009.
Like what? What were they doing before?
Well, for instance, it mandated a 21-day grace period, meaning banks actually had to give you 3 weeks to pay your bill before charging interest.
Which is basic fairness.
Right. It also ended the predatory practice of weekend payment deadlines.
Oh, I remember this. Where if your due date fell on a Sunday when the bank was closed, your mailed check wouldn't be processed until Monday, and they would hit you with a late fee.
Pure sludge. It also required consumers to explicitly opt in for over-limit fees. Historically, a bank would gladly authorize a transaction that pushed you over your credit limit, only to immediately penalize you with a hefty over-limit fee on the next statement.
So they'd let you buy the thing, just so they could punish you for buying it.
Exactly. Under the Card Act, unless you previously agreed to allow those charges and incur the fee, the card would simply be declined at the register.
But perhaps the most complex issue regulators tried to tackle was the psychological warfare of the minimum payment anchor.
Right? And they also had to outlaw one of the most confusing mathematical traps in banking history, double-cycle billing.
Okay, explain double-cycle billing, because it is a perfect example of how complex financial mechanisms obscure true costs.
Prior to the Card Act, if you usually paid your balance in full, you enjoyed a grace period where no interest was charged. But let's say you bought a $1,000 television in January. On January 31st, you paid off $900, leaving a $100 balance to roll over into February.
In a logical world, you would just pay interest on that remaining $100 during February.
But under double-cycle billing, the moment you failed to pay the entire balance, the bank retroactively revoked your grace period for the previous month.
Wait, retroactively?
Yes. On your March statement, they wouldn't just charge you interest on the $100 average daily balance for February. They would reach back, calculate the average daily balance for January when the total was $1,000, and charge you interest on that as well.
You were effectively paying interest on money you had already paid back.
You were. The Card Act explicitly banned this practice.
It's staggering to think that was legal. But let's look at how the Card Act tried to dismantle the anchoring effect. They introduced the 36-month disclosure mandate.
Yes. Regulation Z now requires a clear, conspicuous minimum payment warning table on the very first page of every paper statement. It forces the issuer to show you two very distinct pathways side by side.
The first pathway shows the bleak reality of the minimum payment. It calculates exactly how many years it will take to pay off the current balance and the staggering total cost, including interest, if you make no further purchases and only pay the minimum.
But regulators knew that simply showing a scary number isn't enough, right? Consumers need an alternative anchor to strive toward.
A better serving size.
Exactly. So they mandated a second pathway, a breakdown of exactly what you would need to pay each month to eliminate the debt in exactly 36 months.
The logic makes total sense. Introduce a higher secondary anchor, a target that represents a structured, prudent, government-sanctioned payoff plan.
And overall, the empirical evaluations of this mandate show it was a net positive. It saved consumers roughly $62 million in interest payments annually.
Which is great. But behavioral economics is rarely straightforward. The Texas Law Review analysis revealed a completely unintended, counterintuitive behavioral consequence of this table.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The introduction of the 36-month disclosure inadvertently created a compromise anchor.
A compromise anchor, meaning people met in the middle?
Yes, by prominently displaying this 36-month payoff timeline as a structured, responsible alternative, the statement established a new psychological benchmark for what constitutes good financial behavior.
And here's where human psychology ruins a perfectly good regulatory plan. Let's say you have a consumer who historically paid off their balance in full every month, or maybe aggressively paid it down in large installments over 4 or 5 months.
Right.
They look at their new statement, they see this official-looking box that essentially says, the responsible way to pay this off is over 3 years. And they think, oh, I have 3 years to do this. Why am I stressing myself out paying it off in 4 months?
Precisely the outcome observed. Some consumers anchored downward toward the 36-month number.
Wow.
The sharp increase in people paying the exact 36-month amount wasn't just minimum payers stepping up. It included cardholders who previously paid their balances off much faster, slowing down.
So the compromise anchor pulled higher payers downward, ultimately keeping a specific subset of people in the Sweatbox longer than they would have been without the warning label.
Exactly.
In the Texas Law Review, they mentioned that humans naturally desire commitment devices. The classic example in behavioral economics is the Ulysses contract.
Well, the Ulysses contract is a great concept to bring up here.
Right. Ulysses knows his ship is going to sail past the sirens, and he knows their song will compel him to steer the ship into the rocks. So he pre-commits to a restriction. He orders his crew to tie him to the mast and plug their own ears with beeswax. He deliberately removes his future agency to save himself from his known impulses. If humans genuinely want these guardrails, why didn't the 36-month table function as a proper Ulysses contract?
Well, because a true Ulysses contract requires a binding restriction, and the 36-month disclosure is merely a moving target.
A moving target.
Yeah. The disclosure text explicitly states that the 36-month calculation only applies if you make no new charges. The moment you buy a cup of coffee on that credit card the next morning, the entire 36-month calculation is mathematically void.
Right. A credit card, by its very nature, is a flexible, open-ended instrument. If you can't use it, it defeats the purpose of carrying it.
Exactly. So it looks like a sturdy life raft, but the moment you put any weight in it, the bottom falls out. It's a completely illusory commitment device.
And here is where the story shifts from paper statements to the modern digital reality, because the Card Act was deeply concerned with regulating the physical dimensions of paper.
It was. It mandated font sizes, bold text requirements, and table borders for the bill that arrives in your mailbox.
But the vast majority of consumers no longer interact with paper statements. We manage our finances on glass screens.
Right. And because the Card Act was fundamentally written for a paper paradigm, the banks simply shifted their psychological warfare to a largely unregulated frontier, the user interface of digital apps and online payment portals.
Which introduces the concept of dark patterns.
Dark patterns, yes. The Federal Trade Commission and financial design agencies like UXDA define dark patterns as user interfaces designed to coerce, steer, or deceive users into making choices that actively benefit the business at the direct expense of the user.
Behavioral economist Richard Thaler refers to this specific type of friction as sludge. It's the digital equivalent of making you walk through an endless maze just to find the exit.
Sludge is an apt metaphor because it slows down rational processing. When we analyze the specific banking UX traps highlighted in the UXDA reports, the first and most pervasive mechanism is the pre-selection default.
Oh, this one is universally infuriating. You log into your banking app ready to pay your bill, you navigate to the payment screen, and you are presented with a list of radio buttons.
And invariably, the system has already automatically filled in the radio button for minimum payment due, or perhaps the statement balance, rather than the full current balance.
Yes. By pre-checking the option that maintains your debt load, the interface leverages the status quo bias.
Exactly. Human beings naturally tend to accept preloaded values because it requires less cognitive effort than manually overriding the system. If the minimum payment is already selected, a significant percentage of users will simply click Next and accept the default, assuming the system is guiding them correctly.
It is the digital equivalent of sitting down at a restaurant and the waiter has already placed an order for the most expensive, high-margin item on the menu. You have to actively flag them down, argue with the premise, and manually override their choice just to get a side salad.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. And if you do decide to fight the default, the interface deploys its next weapon, which is visual misdirection.
Visual misdirection. How does that work in an app?
Well, it manipulates the visual hierarchy of the digital page, using scale, color contrast, and spacing to steer your attentional focus.
Oh, we've all seen this. The button to pay minimum is a massive, brightly colored, perfectly rounded rectangle that contrasts heavily with the background. It basically screams for your cursor.
Yes. But the option to pay current balance in full is often muted, low contrast gray text tucked away at the bottom of the screen. Sometimes it doesn't even look like a clickable link. It looks disabled.
Because interface designers are actively exploiting attentional bias. Your eye is biologically drawn to high salience design cues.
Right. By making the minimum payment highly salient and disguising the full balance liquidation options, the app intentionally delays debt repayment by adding micro frictions to the process of finding the right button.
And if you are persistent enough to find the hidden gray text and you actually click Pay in Full, the app throws a final emotional hurdle in your path.
Confirm shaming.
Confirm shaming. It sounds like a bad internet trend.
It is a bad trend, but highly effective. Confirm shaming uses guilt, fear, or a sense of impending scarcity to manipulate a user into backing out of their chosen action.
So when you attempt to pay your balance in full, a modal window, like a pop-up alert, will overlay the screen, interrupting the transaction.
And the language in these pop-ups is incredibly manipulative.
Yeah.
It will say something like, "Are you sure you want to deplete your liquid cash reserves today?" Maintaining a balance ensures your checking account remains flexible for unexpected emergencies.
This plays heavily on loss aversion. In behavioral economics, the psychological pain of losing something in this case, your immediate cash on hand is significantly more powerful than the pleasure of gaining an equivalent benefit, like zero debt.
Exactly. By framing the full payment not as financial freedom, but as a depletion of reserves, the app pressures users into maintaining their deadlines to retain a perceived, yet mathematically illogical, sense of security.
If you walk through a modern casino, you see the exact same environmental design. You walk in with the intention of playing one specific game and leaving.
Right. But there are no clocks on the walls.
The exits are deliberately obscured by curving walkways. The carpet patterns are chaotic to keep you looking up at the flashing, high-salience lights that all invariably point toward the ATM. Every single visual and spatial cue in that environment is ruthlessly optimized to keep your chips on the table.
And your banking app is operating on the exact same principles, just compressed into a 6-inch screen.
That casino comparison extends perfectly to the broader digital ecosystem, actually, because the bank's payment portal is just the final trap in the sequence.
Yeah, for the math of the Sweatbox to truly generate massive profits, the bank needs you to carry a bloated principal balance before you even log in to pay.
That requires a completely different set of manipulators, operated by the e-commerce merchants where you actually use your card.
It really is a coordinated two-front war. The e-commerce merchants deploy dark patterns to inflate your principal balance at checkout, and then the banks deploy dark patterns to prevent you from paying that balance down.
The Federal Trade Commission's comprehensive report, Bringing Dark Patterns to Light, categorizes these e-commerce traps brilliantly.
Let's examine the mechanics of these traps, starting with what the FTC identifies as sneak into basket.
How does that one work?
This occurs during the checkout flow of an online purchase. A user adds a laptop to their digital cart and proceeds to checkout. Unbeknownst to him, the retailer's algorithm has automatically added a $50 screen protector and a $100 extended warranty to the final invoice.
They're banking entirely on inattention blindness. They know the user is experiencing checkout fatigue, rapidly clicking through shipping and billing screens, and is unlikely to meticulously audit the itemized receipt before clicking Confirm Purchase.
Right. They sneak margin padding items into the cart without explicit consent.
Closely related to this is the practice of hidden costs, often referred to in behavioral economics as drip pricing.
Drip pricing. The Venable LLP legal report provides excellent context on this. Imagine ordering food delivery. A cheeseburger is prominently advertised at $14.99.
Okay, sounds good so far.
But you spend 15 minutes choosing the burger, customizing the toppings, entering your delivery address, and typing in your credit card number. And then on the final confirmation screen, the interface drips in the hidden costs.
Ah, yes. There is a service fee, a small order fee, a delivery fee, a care and handling surcharge, and a 3% credit card processing fee. Suddenly, that $15 burger costs $36.
Exactly. By delaying the reveal of the true cost, the platform weaponizes the sunk cost fallacy. The user has already invested significant time and cognitive effort into the transaction.
Rather than abandoning the cart and starting the entire process over on a competing platform, the user simply accepts the inflated price, rationalizing the loss.
Yeah, they just click buy.
Then we have the subscriptions. The FTC categorizes these under forced continuity and the brilliantly named Roach Motel.
Like the old bug trap commercials. Bugs check in, but they don't check out.
Exactly. The Roach Motel design relies on asymmetric effort. It is engineered to be incredibly frictionless to enter financial commitment, but agonizingly difficult to exit.
A platform will offer a free 30-day trial that requires a credit card up front. Initiating the trial takes one click. However, when the user attempts to cancel the trial on day 29, the cancellation pathway is heavily obfuscated.
The cancellation button isn't in the account settings. It's buried 4 submenus deep. Or worse, the digital platform refuses to process digital cancellations entirely,
Forcing the user to call a customer service telephone line that only operates during obscure, highly restricted hours, where they're subjected to aggressive retention scripts by a live agent.
It's exhausting. And if a user does manage to navigate the digital maze to the cancellation page, they are frequently confronted with trick questions.
Right, trick questions. These involve deliberate linguistic ambiguity, often employing double negatives to confuse the user's intent.
You'll see a checkbox that says, uncheck this box if you prefer not to receive updates, or a modal pop-up with a button that says, no, cancel, where clicking cancel actually cancels your attempt to cancel the subscription, reloading you back to the active homepage.
It is dizzying. If you're listening right now, consider your own credit card statement. How many forgotten, auto-renewing $9.99 subscriptions are quietly sitting on your account right now?
You probably know they exist, but the sheer deliberate friction of figuring out how to navigate the Roach Motel keeps you paying month after month.
And every single month, that $10 inflates your principal, accrues interest, and drives up that minimum payment calculation.
The European Union has actually taken a much more aggressive regulatory stance on this under the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR.
They have. The European Data Protection Board categorizes these dark patterns using highly descriptive terminology. They identify overloading, which is confronting users with a massive, fatiguing quantity of requests to prompt unintentional consent.
They also define skipping, where the interface is designed so users routinely bypass data protection implications. Stirring involves appealing directly to emotions via visual nudges, much like confirm shaming, and they explicitly regulate obstructing and keeping users left in the dark.
The European regulators are actively mapping the sludge. But knowing all of this, understanding the deep history of revolving debt, the psychological weight of the minimum payment anchor, and the deliberate digital friction of dark patterns, the question becomes, how does the industry reform?
And more immediately, how do you protect yourself?
Looking toward industry reform, the financial design agency UXDA proposes a comprehensive framework called dopamine banking.
Dopamine banking.
The foundational premise is that the long-term profitability of a financial institution shouldn't rely on adversarial design. Instead of utilizing dark patterns to trap users, banks should leverage ethical UX to build genuine transparency and foster long-term financial health.
So what does ethical dopamine banking actually look like when you log into an app?
The most critical implementation is visual default neutrality. In an ethical billing portal, the interface absolutely cannot pre-select any default payment option.
So no auto-checked minimum payment box.
None. When you reach the payment screen, you are presented with 3 identical options: pay in full, statement balance, and custom amount. These options must possess the exact same pixel dimensions, the exact same color contrast, and the exact same font weight.
It levels the playing field. It removes the status quo bias and forces the user to make a deliberate, conscious, unguided choice about their debt.
Furthermore, dopamine banking involves a psychological shift away from gamification. Currently, addictive app designs rely on extrinsic rewards, points, badges, animations, and streaks to keep you logging in and clicking.
Right.
Ethical design aims to cultivate intrinsic motivation. An app might celebrate your first few large principal payments to help you build initial momentum, but over time, it phases out the flashy animations.
The goal is for the user to find deep, intrinsic fulfillment simply in observing their total debt shrink and their net worth grow, rather than relying on a manufactured dopamine hit from clicking a glowing button.
Exactly. That is a phenomenal blueprint for the future of financial software.
But the reality is, the banking app currently sitting on your phone is likely not practicing visual default neutrality. So what structural changes can you implement today to bypass these highly optimized algorithms?
First, you must actively train your brain to ignore the anchor. When you review your statement, you must aggressively skip over the minimum payment due box. Do not let that number enter your working memory.
Look exclusively at the total balance and the exact dollar amount of interest charged that month. You have to force your internal monologue to shift from, can I afford the minimum, to what is the true cost of carrying this debt?
That cognitive shift is essential, but willpower alone is a finite and fragile resource. If your strategy relies on logging into a hostile interface every single month, fighting past the pre-selected defaults, ignoring the high salience minimum payment button, and surviving the confirm shaming pop-ups, eventually you will experience cognitive fatigue.
You will have a stressful month where you just click the path of least resistance.
Therefore, the ultimate defense mechanism is to automate above the minimum.
You have to completely remove the decision-making friction. You bypass the digital casino entirely. You set up an automatic payment plan, ideally pushed directly from your primary checking account rather than pulled through the credit card's portal.
Right, for a fixed aggressive dollar amount that heavily exceeds the minimum requirement.
By automating the aggressive payment, you defeat the dark patterns because you never expose your attention to them in the first place.
Consider the implications of everything we have discussed today. The evolution of revolving debt proves that institutions view consumer psychology as a resource to be harvested.
The math of the Sweatbox is a deliberate construct, and the interfaces you interact with are the fences keeping you inside that construct.
Which fundamentally changes how we should view our digital interactions.
Absolutely. Before we close this out, I want to explore one final profound legal theory that emerged from a review of the sources, specifically concerning emerging privacy laws.
Yes. The intersection of behavioral design and legal consent is arguably the most fascinating frontier in this space. We examined the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, alongside similar state-level privacy frameworks.
And a critical, groundbreaking component of these new laws is the explicit statutory declaration that consent obtained through the use of a dark pattern does not constitute valid legal consent.
Let's unpack the magnitude of that. Under the CCPA, if a website uses visual misdirection, trick questions, or pre-selected defaults to manipulate you into accepting tracking cookies, the law views that consent as entirely invalid.
The company cannot legally claim you agreed to the terms because the interface subverted your autonomy.
Now, apply that exact same legal theory to consumer debt. Imagine a scenario where a credit card portal heavily utilizes pre-selected defaults for the minimum payment, visually hides the full payment options, and deploys aggressive confirm shaming when you try to pay down your principal.
As a direct result of that highly engineered digital friction, you remain in the sweatbox, accruing massive compounding interest charges over several years.
The paradigm-shifting question is, could a future legal challenge argue that you never actually gave valid autonomous consent to carry that high-interest debt?
If the digital interface deliberately bypassed your rational decision-making and coerced your clicks, is the resulting financial contract and the thousands of dollars in interest revenue it generated legally valid?
It is a profound legal question that strikes at the very foundation of digital revolving debt. If courts begin to rule that dark patterns fundamentally invalidate financial consent, the entire algorithmic architecture of the Sweatbox could be standing on incredibly fragile legal ground.
It suggests that interface design isn't just a marketing tool, it is a legally binding mechanism of intent.
It is a massive concept to mull over.
The next time you open a statement and see that $35 minimum payment sitting next to a $5,000 balance, I hope the wave of relief is gone. I hope instead you see the ghosts of the Fresno drop. I hope you see the mathematical certainty of the sweatbox, the gravitational pull of the behavioral anchor, and the deliberate sludge-filled architecture of the interface, all working in tandem to build a trap. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Stay curious, protect your attention, and go set up those automated payments. We will see you next time.